My name is Lydia. I'm 67 years old, and I never imagined my own son would hand me $10 and tell me to leave his house when I needed him most. As I sat on that cold bus bench with nothing but a worn purse, those crumpled bills, and a cancer diagnosis burning in my pocket, I wondered how we had gotten here. The son I had raised alone, sacrificed everything for, had just turned his back on me in my darkest hour. But what he didn't know was that this moment would change everything. Before I share this journey with you, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that prove it's never too late to start over. Now let me tell you how one cruel moment led to the most surprising chapter of my life. Looking back now, I can hardly believe how different things used to be between Marcus and me. There was a time when my son was my whole world, and I thought I was his too. After my husband David passed away from a heart attack when Marcus was only 12, it became just the two of us against the world. Those early years were tough, but they were also filled with a kind of love and closeness I treasure even today. I remember working 3 shifts at Mercy General Hospital just to make ends meet. As a registered nurse, I could pick up extra hours whenever they were available, and believe me, they were always available. I'd work the morning shift, grab a quick nap in the break room, then cover the evening shift for whoever called in sick. Sometimes I'd even stay for the night shift if they were short-staffed. My feet would ache something terrible, and I'd fall into bed just as Marcus was getting ready for school. But it was all worth it to see that boy succeed. Marcus was brilliant with numbers, always had been. Even as a child, he could calculate tips and tax in his head faster than most adults could with a calculator. I knew he was destined for something bigger than our little 2-bedroom apartment above the pharmacy on Elm Street. So when he got accepted to State University with a partial scholarship, I made sure he could go. I picked up even more shifts, sold David's old truck, and even took out a second mortgage on the tiny house David and I had bought before he died. Those college years were the hardest financially, but also some of the proudest of my life. Marcus would call me every Sunday evening, telling me about his accounting classes, his internships, his plans for the future. He'd always end those calls the same way. "Thanks for everything, Mom. I'm going to make you proud and pay you back for all of this someday." And I believed him. Not because I needed paying back, but because I could hear the sincerity in his voice. When Marcus graduated summa cum laude and landed a job at a prestigious accounting firm downtown, I felt like I could finally breathe. He moved into his own apartment, a nice 1-bedroom place in the business district, and for the first few years we stayed close. He'd come over every other Sunday for dinner, bringing flowers or a bottle of wine. We'd sit in my little kitchen, the same one where I'd helped him with homework all those years, and he'd tell me about his clients, his promotions, his growing success. But then he met Amanda. Amanda Rodriguez came from money, real money. Her father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across 3 states, and her mother was some kind of socialite who organized charity galas for the country club set. Amanda was beautiful, polished, and had never worked a day in her life. She also had very specific ideas about what kind of life she wanted to live, and what kind of people she wanted to associate with. The changes in Marcus started slowly. First, it was the way he dressed. Gone were the simple button-down shirts and khakis replaced by expensive suits and Italian leather shoes. Then it was his car. He traded in his reliable Honda Civic for a BMW that cost more than I made in 2 years. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said Amanda thought image was important in his business. The Sunday dinners became less frequent. Every other week turned into once a month, then every few months. When he did come by, Amanda rarely joined him, and when she did, she'd sit stiffly at my kitchen table checking her phone and making polite but distant conversation. I could feel her judging everything: my mismatched dishes, my secondhand furniture, the way I still clipped coupons from the Sunday paper. Marcus started talking differently too. He'd use phrases like networking opportunities and social circles and maintaining appearances. When I mentioned that my neighbor Mrs. Peterson could use help with her medical bills, he'd change the subject. When I told him about volunteering at the free clinic on weekends, he'd look uncomfortable and check his watch. The engagement happened fast. One day Marcus called to tell me he was proposing the next week. They were planning a wedding that cost more than my annual salary. I offered to help with whatever I could, but Amanda's mother had already hired a wedding planner who charged more per hour than I made in a day. I felt like an outsider at my own son's wedding, seated at a table in the back with distant relatives, while Amanda's family held court at the head table. After the wedding, Marcus and Amanda moved into a beautiful colonial house in Westwood Estates, the kind of neighborhood where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every driveway held luxury cars. I was so proud when Marcus gave me the tour, pointing out the granite countertops and hardwood floors. But I noticed he didn't invite me to the housewarming party. When I asked about it later, he said it was just a small gathering for Amanda's friends from the country club. The visits to my house stopped altogether. If I wanted to see my son, I had to drive the 40 minutes to Westwood Estates, and even then the visits felt strained and formal. Amanda would serve expensive wine and cheese on crystal plates, and we'd sit in their pristine living room making small talk. Marcus seemed nervous, like he was worried I might embarrass him somehow. I tried to connect with Amanda, asking about her interests, complimenting her decorating, but her responses were always polite and brief. I started to feel like I was losing my son to a world I didn't understand and wasn't welcome in. The boy who used to help me plant tomatoes in our tiny backyard garden was now too busy with charity golf tournaments and wine tastings to return my calls promptly. When I mentioned feeling lonely in my empty house, he'd suggest I should make friends with people in your own social circle. It hurt, but I told myself he was just busy building his new life. My little house on Elm Street suddenly felt very quiet and very small. David's pictures still lined the mantelpiece, and Marcus's old bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it when he went away to college. I'd find myself setting 2 plates at dinner time out of habit, then putting one back with a sigh. The garden I'd always loved working in started feeling like too much work, and I began spending more time indoors reading nursing journals and watching old movies on television. I should have seen the signs of what was coming. The increasing distance, the way Marcus would tense up when I mentioned money troubles or health concerns, the way Amanda would check her watch whenever I stayed too long. But I was his mother. I had loved him unconditionally for 35 years. I never imagined that love wouldn't be enough when I needed him most. The first symptoms were so subtle, I almost ignored them. A persistent cough that lingered after what I thought was just a winter cold. Fatigue that seemed deeper than what I'd expect from working long shifts at the hospital. I was 67 after all. Wasn't feeling tired, just part of getting older. But the cough got worse. It developed a harsh, raspy quality that made my colleagues at work look concerned. Dr. Martinez, one of the physicians I'd worked with for over a decade, pulled me aside after I had a coughing fit during morning rounds. "Lydia, how long have you had that cough?" he asked, his dark eyes serious behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Oh, just a few weeks," I said, waving him off. "It's probably just allergies. You know how the pollen gets this time of year?" But Dr. Martinez wasn't buying it. "It's December, Lydia, and that doesn't sound like allergies to me. When's the last time you had a chest X-ray?" I realized with some embarrassment that I couldn't remember. Like many healthcare workers, I was better at taking care of everyone else than taking care of myself. Between work and worrying about Marcus's increasing distance, I'd been neglecting my own health checkups. "I want you to go down to radiology right now," Dr. Martinez said, and his tone left no room for argument. "Promise me." So I went. The X-ray technician was a sweet young woman named Jessica, who chatted cheerfully while positioning me for the films. But when the images came up on the screen, her cheerful demeanor changed to professional concern. She excused herself to call the radiologist, and I knew with the intuition that comes from 30-plus years in healthcare that something was wrong. Dr. Patricia Chen, the radiologist, was kind but direct when she called me into her office an hour later. The X-rays showed a suspicious mass in my left lung about the size of a golf ball. She explained it as gently as possible, but medical training had taught me to cut through euphemisms and get to the facts. "You're talking about cancer," I said flatly. "We need to do more tests to be certain," Dr. Chen replied. "But yes, that's what we're concerned about." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of appointments, tests, and waiting rooms. CT scans, PT scans, biopsies, blood work. I went through the motions of my normal routine, working my shifts and maintaining my usual cheerful demeanor with patients. But inside, I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. The final consultation came on a Thursday afternoon in Dr. Patricia Kim's office. Dr. Kim was an oncologist I'd known professionally for years, a brilliant woman who specialized in lung cancer treatment. But sitting across from her desk as a patient instead of a colleague felt surreal. "The biopsy confirms non-small cell lung carcinoma," she said, her hands folded carefully on my file. "Stage 2. The good news is, we caught it before it spread to your lymph nodes. With surgery followed by chemotherapy, the 5-year survival rate is very encouraging." Surgery. Chemotherapy. The words hit me like physical blows. I'd seen hundreds of cancer patients over the years, had held their hands during treatments, had celebrated remissions, and mourned losses. But I'd never imagined myself on this side of the diagnosis. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" I asked, my nursing training kicking in to help me ask the right questions. "We'd want to schedule surgery within the next 3 weeks," Dr. Kim explained. "The procedure would involve removing the affected portion of your lung. Recovery is typically 6 to 8 weeks, followed by 4 to 6 months of chemotherapy. The total cost, even with Medicare, will likely run around $60,000 in out-of-pocket expenses." $60,000. The number hung in the air between us. On my nurse's salary, even after 30 years of working, that might as well have been $60 million. I'd never been able to save much, not after putting Marcus through college and helping him get started in his career. "I'll also need to ask about your support system," Dr. Kim continued gently. "Do you have family who can help during recovery? The first few weeks after surgery, you won't be able to cook for yourself, or handle heavy lifting. Chemotherapy can be quite debilitating as well." Family. Support system. The words echoed in my head as I drove home that evening. I had Marcus, of course. He was my only family left since David died. Surely when he heard about the diagnosis, he'd step up. This was bigger than whatever social pressures Amanda had been putting on him. This was life and death. This was his mother. That night I sat in my kitchen for hours staring at the phone on the wall. The same phone where Marcus used to call me every Sunday during college. The same phone where he'd called to tell me about his promotion, his engagement, his new house. Now I needed to use it to tell him the most frightening news I'd ever had to share. I picked up the receiver 3 times before finally dialing his number. It rang 4 times before he answered, and I could hear the sound of dinner party conversation in the background. "Mom?" He sounded surprised and slightly annoyed. "What's wrong? Amanda and I are entertaining some clients from work." "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "But I need to tell you something important. I went to the doctor today and—" I heard him excuse himself from his guests, probably stepping into another room. When he came back on the line, his voice was impatient. "What is it, Mom? Can this wait until tomorrow? We're right in the middle of something important here." Important. More important than his mother's cancer diagnosis. I felt something cold settle in my chest, but I pressed on. "I have lung cancer, Marcus." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long, I thought the call had dropped. "Marcus, are you there?" "Yeah, I'm here." His voice was flat, emotionless. "How bad is it?" I explained what Dr. Kim had told me about the surgery, the chemotherapy, the recovery timeline. As I talked, I could hear Amanda's laughter in the background, and I wondered if she even knew her husband was taking this call. "What about treatment costs?" Marcus asked when I finished. "The doctor estimates about $60,000 out of pocket even with Medicare." Another long silence. That's a lot of money, Mom." "I know it is." I waited for him to say what I needed to hear, that he'd help, that we'd figure it out together. That family was more important than money. Instead, he said, "I'll need to think about this. Let me talk to Amanda and see what we can do. I'll call you back in a few days." A few days. I was facing cancer surgery in 3 weeks, and my son needed a few days to think about helping me. Marcus, I'm scared, I said, my voice finally breaking. I know, Mom. Just, just give me some time to process this. Okay, this is a lot to take in. The line went dead, and I sat there holding the receiver until the dial tone became unbearable. 3 days passed with no word from Marcus, then 4, then a full week. I left one voicemail trying to keep my voice steady as I reminded him that time was important with cancer treatment. He didn't call back. 2 weeks after my diagnosis, sitting in my empty kitchen with surgical consent forms spread across the table, I realized I was truly alone. The son I had raised, sacrificed for, and loved unconditionally was going to let me face this battle by myself. The realization was almost worse than the cancer diagnosis itself. On a cold Tuesday morning in March, I made the decision that would change everything. I couldn't wait any longer for Marcus to call back. Surgery was scheduled for the following week, and I needed to know where I stood. I needed to hear from my own son whether he was going to help me through this or not. I drove the 40 minutes to Westwood Estates with my heart pounding and my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The beautiful neighborhood looked even more pristine in the morning light, with its perfectly trimmed hedges and spotless sidewalks. Every house seemed to whisper money and success and belonging to a world I'd never really understood. Marcus and Amanda's colonial house sat on a corner lot, its red brick facade and white pillars making it look like something from a magazine. The circular driveway held both of their cars, his BMW and her white Mercedes convertible. I parked my 15-year-old Honda on the street, suddenly self-conscious about its rust spots and the duct tape holding the back bumper together. I rang the doorbell and waited, trying to rehearse what I would say. The door opened and Amanda appeared wearing an expensive-looking workout outfit and holding a cup of coffee in a porcelain mug. Her face immediately tightened when she saw me. "Lydia," she said, not moving from the doorway. "Marcus didn't mention you were coming by." I called ahead, but no one answered. I lied. The truth was, I'd been afraid if I called, they might find an excuse not to be home. "Is Marcus here? I really need to speak with both of you." Amanda glanced back into the house, clearly uncomfortable. "He's getting ready for work. We have a very important meeting this morning with potential investors." "This will only take a few minutes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's about my medical situation." With obvious reluctance, Amanda stepped aside to let me in. The house was even more beautiful on the inside than I remembered. Fresh flowers sat in crystal vases on polished tables, and everything was arranged with the kind of perfection that suggested either professional decorating or an obsessive attention to detail. Marcus appeared at the top of the staircase, adjusting his tie. When he saw me, his expression went through a series of changes: surprise, guilt, and finally annoyance. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he asked as he came down the stairs. "I told you I'd call you back." "That was 2 weeks ago, Marcus. Surgery is scheduled for Monday." He reached the bottom of the stairs and stood next to Amanda, presenting a united front. Both of them were dressed expensively and looked like they'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. I suddenly became very aware of my worn jeans and the old cardigan I'd thrown on that morning. "Can we sit down?" I asked. "Please, I need to talk to you both about what's going to happen." Amanda and Marcus exchanged a look, and I could see some kind of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Amanda gestured toward the living room, and we all sat down on furniture that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. "The surgery is Monday." I began, perching on the edge of a cream-colored sofa. "Dr. Kim says recovery will take 6 to 8 weeks, and I can't be alone during that time. I was hoping—" "Mom," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. "We've talked about this. Amanda and I have very busy lives. We travel for work, we have social obligations, we have responsibilities." "I'm your mother, Marcus. Doesn't that count as a responsibility?" Amanda spoke up for the first time, her voice cool and measured. "Lydia, we understand this is difficult, but you have to understand our position too. We're building something here. Marcus is up for partner at his firm, and my family has invested a lot in our future together." "What does that have to do with helping me recover from cancer surgery?" "Image matters in our circles. Amanda continued as if she was explaining something to a child. Having a sick elderly relative living here would send the wrong message to Marcus's colleagues and potential clients. I stared at her, not quite believing what I was hearing. The wrong message. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. What Amanda means is that we need to maintain a certain lifestyle. Our house, our social circle, everything has to project success and stability. And having your mother here would undermine that. It's not personal, Mom, Marcus said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. It's just business. Business. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and unfamiliar. Marcus, I worked 3 jobs to put you through college. I mortgaged my house to pay for your education. I sacrificed everything so you could have the life you're so worried about protecting. That was your choice, he said coldly. I didn't ask you to do that. His words hit me like a physical blow. I looked at this man, this stranger wearing my son's face, and wondered when everything had gone so wrong. So what am I supposed to do? I asked quietly. I can't drive for weeks after surgery. I can't cook or clean or take care of myself. The doctor says I need someone there in case of complications. Amanda and Marcus looked at each other again, and I could see they'd already discussed this. There are facilities, Amanda said. Nursing homes, extended care places. I'm sure one of them would be perfect for someone in your situation. Someone in my situation, I repeated numbly. Marcus stood up and walked to a desk in the corner of the room. He opened a drawer, pulled out his wallet, and counted out some bills. When he came back, he held out a small stack of money. This should help with immediate expenses, he said. Maybe cover a taxi to wherever you decide to go. I looked down at the money in his hand. $10. 2 fives, crisp and new. My son was offering me $10 to disappear from his life. $10? I whispered. It's enough for bus fare, Amanda said matter-of-factly. And there are social services that can help people like you. People like me. His mother. The woman who had raised him alone loved him unconditionally, sacrificed everything for his success. I took the money with trembling hands, not because I wanted it, but because the gesture was so absurd, it felt like something from a nightmare. $10 from the son I'd given everything to. Marcus, I said one last time, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm your mother. I raised you. I loved you. I'm facing cancer alone, and this is what you're offering me. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe, or recognition of what he was doing. But Amanda reached over and touched his arm, and whatever softness I'd glimpsed disappeared. Mom, you need to understand that we can't take care of you, he said, his voice gaining strength, as if he'd been practicing these words. We have our own lives, our own plans. What you did for me when I was a kid, that was your job as a parent. I don't owe you anything for that. The room went very quiet. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, marking the seconds in what felt like the longest moment of my life. I stood up slowly, my knees suddenly feeling weak. The $10 crumpled in my fist as I looked at my son and his wife, sitting there in their beautiful living room, surrounded by all the expensive things their success had bought them. You're right, I said finally. You don't owe me anything, and after today, you won't. I walked to the front door on unsteady legs, aware that Marcus and Amanda were following me, but not turning around to look at them. My hand was on the doorknob when Marcus spoke one last time. Mom, wait. I didn't mean... I turned around and looked at him, this stranger who used to be my little boy. Yes, you did mean it, I said quietly. And now I know exactly where I stand. I walked out of that beautiful house down the perfect driveway and got into my beat-up Honda. Through the rearview mirror, I could see Marcus standing in the doorway, watching me drive away. But he didn't come after me. He didn't call out. He just stood there, as I left his life, with nothing but $10 and a broken heart. As I drove away from Westwood Estates, for what I knew would be the last time, I made a decision that would surprise even me. I wasn't going home to my empty house on Elm Street. I wasn't going to sit there and wait to die alone. I was going to disappear just like Amanda had suggested, but not in the way they expected. I was going to survive this, and I was going to build a life so different, so unexpected, that when my son finally realized what he'd lost, it would be too late to get it back. The first night was the hardest. I drove around the city for hours that crumpled $10 on the passenger seat beside me, trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. The surgery was in 5 days, and I still hadn't solved the basic problem of where I would recover. More importantly, I was starting to realize I didn't want to go back to my old life at all. The house on Elm Street held too many memories of the son who had just abandoned me. Every room would remind me of the little boy I'd raised, the young man I'd been so proud of, and the stranger who had handed me bus fare and told me to disappear. I couldn't face going back to that emptiness, waiting for phone calls that would never come. Around midnight, I found myself parked outside the 24-hour diner downtown, where Marcus and I used to go for pancakes after his Little League games. I sat in the parking lot watching the late-shift waitresses move around inside and tried to figure out what came next. That's when I saw the sign across the street. Hope Haven Community Center, it read. Housing assistance, meal programs, crisis counseling. Walk-ins welcome. Something about those words, walk-ins welcome, made me feel like maybe I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. I spent that first night in a chair in the community center's lobby. Margaret Santos, the night coordinator, was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who didn't ask too many questions when I showed up looking lost and carrying nothing but my purse. She brought me a cup of coffee and a blanket and told me about the temporary housing program they ran for people in crisis. We have partnerships with several facilities in the area, she explained quietly, mindful of the other people sleeping in chairs around us. Places that offer short-term housing for people who are between situations. Medical situations, family situations, job situations, life situations. Life situations. That seemed like a good way to describe what I was facing. The next morning, Margaret drove me to Sunset Gardens, a residential facility about 20 minutes outside the city. It wasn't a nursing home exactly, and it wasn't an apartment complex. It was something in between, a place for older adults who needed some support but weren't ready for full-time care. The building was older but well-maintained, with a brick facade and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Inside, it felt warm and lived in nothing like the sterile perfection of Marcus's house. The common areas had comfortable furniture that actually looked like people used it, and there were plants everywhere, some of them clearly tended by residents who knew what they were doing. Mrs. Elena Hoffman, the director, was a practical woman who'd been running Sunset Gardens for 15 years. She listened to my situation without judgment and offered me a small efficiency apartment on the second floor. The rent is based on income, she explained as we walked down a hallway lined with landscape paintings. Most of our residents are on fixed incomes, so we work with what people can afford. The apartment comes furnished with basics, and meals are available in the dining room if you don't feel like cooking. The efficiency was small but clean, with a Murphy bed, a tiny kitchenette, and a window that looked out over a garden where several residents were working among the tomato plants. It wasn't much, but it felt safe. More importantly, it felt like a place where I could be invisible while I figured out what came next. There's one more thing, Mrs. Hoffman said, as I signed the short-term lease agreement. We encourage community here. People look out for each other. If you're going through medical treatment, you won't have to do it alone. That afternoon, I called Dr. Kim's office and gave them my new address. The surgery was still scheduled for Monday, but now I had somewhere to recover. It wasn't the family support she'd asked about, but it was something. I spent the weekend moving my few belongings from Elm Street to Sunset Gardens. The house felt like a museum of my old life as I packed clothes, medications, and a few personal items. I left almost everything else behind: the furniture, the dishes, most of the photographs. I couldn't bear to take reminders of Marcus with me to this new chapter. On Sunday evening, I met some of my new neighbors. Helen Garcia was a retired high school teacher who'd moved to Sunset Gardens after her husband died. She had silver hair that she wore in a practical bob and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Robert Williams was a former carpenter whose arthritis had forced him into retirement, but who still built beautiful birdhouses in the facility's workshop. We sat in the common room after dinner, and I found myself telling them about the surgery, though I left out the details about Marcus. I wasn't ready to talk about that wound yet. "Surgery's scary," Helen said matter-of-factly. "I had my gallbladder out 2 years ago, and I was terrified. But you know what I discovered? You're stronger than you think you are. And recovery gives you time to think about things differently." "Time to think about what?" I asked. "About what you want the rest of your life to look like," Robert said, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "Most of us end up here because something changed. A spouse died, kids moved away, health problems, money problems. But change isn't always bad. Sometimes it's just different. Different." That night, lying in my new bed and looking out at the garden, I thought about that word. My life was certainly going to be different now. The question was whether I could make it better than what I'd left behind. The surgery on Monday went smoothly. Dr. Kim removed a section of my left lung, and the pathology report confirmed that they'd gotten all of the cancer. The recovery was harder than I'd expected, but not as hard as doing it alone would have been. Helen visited every day, bringing books and gossip from the common room. Robert showed up with a wooden bird feeder he'd made for my window, saying the cardinals would give me something to watch during the long days of recovery. Other residents stopped by with soup magazines or just to check that I was okay. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere, not because of what I could provide or sacrifice for someone else, but just because I was a person who deserved kindness and community. The chemotherapy started 6 weeks later and was exactly as miserable as everyone had warned me it would be. But even on the worst days when I was too sick to get out of bed, I wasn't alone. The people at Sunset Gardens had created their own family, and somehow I'd become part of it. 3 months into treatment, Helen made an observation that would change everything. "You know, Lydia," she said, as we sat in the garden one afternoon, "you have a gift for telling stories. The way you talk about your nursing experiences, about the patients you've cared for over the years. People need to hear those stories." I'd been sharing memories during our evening conversations in the common room. Stories about the premature baby who'd fought for 3 months before finally going home healthy. The elderly man who'd taught me to play chess during his long recovery from a stroke. The young mother who'd beaten cervical cancer and gone on to have 2 more children. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean you should write them down," Helen said simply. "These stories matter. They're about hope and resilience and the human spirit. People need to be reminded that those things exist." Writing. I'd never considered myself a writer. I'd been a nurse, a mother, a caregiver. But as I sat there in that garden surrounded by people who'd become my chosen family, I started to think that maybe Helen was right. Maybe those stories did matter. And maybe telling them was exactly what I needed to do, with whatever years I had left. The idea started small. Helen had mentioned the community center's computer lab, where residents could use donated laptops to stay in touch with family or pursue hobbies. I'd never been particularly comfortable with technology, but the young volunteer who ran the lab, Timothy Rodriguez, was patient and enthusiastic about teaching older adults new skills. "Start with whatever feels natural," he suggested during my first session. "Don't worry about formatting or fancy features. Just tell a story like you would to a friend." So I did. I started with Maria Santos, a young mother who'd come into the emergency room 9 years earlier with severe abdominal pain. She was terrified, speaking broken English and holding the hand of her 3-year-old daughter, Sophia. The pain turned out to be appendicitis, but the surgery revealed something much worse, stage 3 ovarian cancer that had already begun spreading. As I typed slowly and with many corrections, the memory came back in vivid detail. Maria's brave smile when she told Sophia that Mama was just going to sleep for a while. The way her husband Carlos paced the waiting room wearing work clothes because he'd come straight from his construction job. The months of chemotherapy that followed, during which Maria never lost her determination to beat the disease for her daughter's sake. The story took me 3 hours to write, and when I finished, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose. This wasn't just Maria's story. It was a testament to courage and love, and the power of not giving up. Helen read it that evening in the common room, and by the time she finished, half a dozen residents had gathered to listen. When she was done, the room was quiet for a long moment. "My goodness," said Dorothy Stevens, a retired librarian. "That's beautiful, Lydia. That poor young woman. Did she survive?" "She did," I said. "Last I heard, Sophia was 12 years old, and Maria was 5 years cancer-free. She volunteers at the hospital now, translating for Spanish-speaking patients." "You need to write more of these," Robert said firmly. "People need to hear about the good in the world. There's enough bad news everywhere else." So I did write more. The story of James Patterson, a Vietnam veteran who donated bone marrow to a stranger and ended up saving a young boy's life. The account of Eleanor Martinez, an 80-year-old woman who'd survived 3 heart attacks and used her experience to start a cardiac support group that was still meeting 15 years later. Each story took several days to write, and each one drew a small audience in the common room. Word began to spread beyond Sunset Gardens. Helen mentioned the stories to her former teaching colleagues, Robert told his poker buddies, and Dorothy shared them with her book club. After 2 months of writing, I had 12 stories totaling nearly 50 pages. Timothy helped me create a simple blog on the community center's website, and suddenly my stories were available for anyone to read. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The first email came from a woman named Patricia Johnson, whose mother was facing a cancer diagnosis similar to what I'd overcome. "Your story gave her hope," Patricia wrote. "She printed it out and carries it to her chemo appointments. Thank you for showing her that survival is possible." More emails followed. A doctor in Seattle forwarded my stories to his patients. A social worker in Detroit used them in support groups. A chaplain at a children's hospital read them to families facing difficult diagnoses. 6 months after I'd started writing my blog, had over 10,000 regular readers. The stories were being shared on social media, printed out, and passed hand to hand, and translated into Spanish and Portuguese by volunteers who wanted to reach broader audiences. That's when Sarah Thompson called. Sarah was a young editor at Healing Words Press, a small publishing house that specialized in inspirational nonfiction. She'd found my blog through a friend who worked in healthcare, and had been following my stories for months. "I'd like to discuss turning your blog into a book," she said during our first phone conversation. "These stories deserve a wider audience than the internet can provide. Have you ever considered traditional publishing?" I almost laughed. A book? I was a 67-year-old former nurse living in a residential facility, writing stories on a donated computer. The idea that anyone would want to publish my work seemed absurd. But Sarah was serious. She explained that there was a growing market for authentic, hopeful stories in healthcare settings. Patients, families, and healthcare workers themselves were hungry for narratives that focused on healing and resilience, rather than just medical procedures and statistics. "Your stories do something special," she said. "They remind people that behind every diagnosis there's a human being with hopes and fears, and the capacity for extraordinary courage. That's exactly what the world needs right now." Helen convinced me to take the meeting. "What do you have to lose?" she asked. "The worst thing that happens is you get a free lunch and an interesting conversation." The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a small cafe downtown. I spent 3 days agonizing over what to wear, finally settling on my best dress and the pearl earrings David had given me for our 20th anniversary. I felt nervous and out of place, like I was pretending to be something I wasn't. Sarah turned out to be a warm, energetic woman in her 30s with curly red hair and an infectious enthusiasm for books. She'd brought a manila folder full of printouts from my blog, many of them marked with notes and highlighting. "I've been in publishing for 8 years, she said over coffee and sandwiches, "and I've never seen reader response like what your stories generate. Look at this." She showed me pages of comments and emails from my blog. "People aren't just reading these stories, they're sharing them with everyone they know. That's the mark of something special." She outlined her proposal. Healing Words. Press wanted to publish a collection of my stories expanded and edited for a general audience. They would provide professional editing support, cover design, marketing assistance, and distribution to bookstores nationwide. "We're thinking of calling it Healing Heart Stories from the Bedside," Sarah said. "But we're open to suggestions if you have ideas." How much would something like this cost? I asked, still not quite believing the conversation was real. Sarah smiled. It doesn't cost you anything, Lydia. We pay you. This is a traditional publishing contract, which means you'd receive an advance against future royalties, plus a percentage of all book sales. She slid a document across the table. The advance amount was $50,000. I stared at the number, sure I was misreading it. $50,000. More money than I'd ever had at one time in my entire life. I don't understand, I said quietly. These are just stories about patients I remember. Why would anyone pay for that? Because they're not just stories, Sarah replied. They're proof that healing is about more than medicine. They're evidence that hope and love and human connection can be just as powerful as any treatment. In a world where healthcare feels increasingly cold and impersonal, your stories remind people that compassion still exists. I took the contract home to show Helen and Robert. We spread it out on the dining room table and read through it together, looking up unfamiliar terms and discussing the implications. Lydia, Helen said when we'd finished reading, this is your chance to touch thousands of lives, maybe hundreds of thousands. Your stories could help people going through the worst moments of their lives. But I'm just a retired nurse living in a facility for older adults, I protested. What do I know about being an author? You know about human nature, Robert said firmly. You know about kindness and courage and what people are capable of when they're pushed to their limits. That's all any good author needs to know. 3 days later, I signed the contract. 6 months after that, Healing Heart Stories from the Bedside was sitting in bookstores across the country. The book's success exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. Within a month of publication, it had sold over 20,000 copies and was climbing the bestseller lists in the health and inspiration categories. More importantly, the letters and emails from readers continued to pour in. A nurse in Portland wrote that she kept a copy at the nurses' station and read from it during difficult shifts. A cancer patient in Miami said the stories helped her find the courage to continue treatment when she wanted to give up. A medical student in Boston wrote that my book had reminded him why he'd wanted to become a doctor in the first place. Sarah arranged a series of speaking engagements at hospitals' medical conferences and book clubs. I'd never spoken publicly before, but something about sharing these stories felt natural and necessary. Standing in front of audiences of healthcare workers, patients, and families, I could see how hungry people were for reminders that healing was still possible, that hope still mattered. The speaking fees were modest at first, a few $100s per appearance. But as word spread about the impact of my presentations, the invitations became more prestigious and better compensated. I spoke at nursing conventions, medical ethics symposiums, and patient advocacy conferences across the country. The second book, Second Chances When Life Begins at 67, told my own story for the first time. It was harder to write than the first collection, requiring me to be vulnerable about Marcus's abandonment, my cancer diagnosis, and the journey that had led me to discover writing. But readers responded even more strongly to this personal narrative. Second Chances became a New York Times bestseller within 2 weeks of publication. The advance for this book was $250,000, and the royalty checks that followed were larger than my annual nursing salary had ever been. But more than the money, it was the response from readers that overwhelmed me. Thousands of people wrote to tell me that my story had inspired them to pursue delayed dreams, mend broken relationships, or simply refuse to give up during difficult times. A 70-year-old man started college for the first time after reading about my late-in-life career change. A woman estranged from her adult children reached out to them after reading about forgiveness and new beginnings. The media attention was intense, but largely positive. I appeared on morning talk shows, was featured in magazine articles, and gave interviews to newspapers across the country. The shy, abandoned mother who'd left Marcus's house with $10 was becoming a recognizable face in the world of inspirational literature. With my newfound financial security, I was able to move out of Sunset Gardens and into a beautiful townhouse just a few miles away. But I made sure to stay close enough to visit my chosen family regularly. Helen, Robert, Dorothy, and the others had been with me during the darkest period of my life, and I wasn't going to abandon them just because my circumstances had improved. The new house was everything I'd never allowed myself to dream of. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a modern kitchen, and a backyard garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers. But it was the home office that meant the most to me. A sunny room with built-in bookshelves, a proper desk, and a view of the garden, where I could write in comfort and peace. 2 years after signing my first book contract, I was financially independent for the first time in my life. The royalty checks alone were enough to live comfortably, and the speaking engagements provided additional income that I often donated to medical charities and programs for older adults. More books followed. Compassion chronicles more stories from the heart, collected reader submissions about acts of kindness in healthcare settings. Finding Grace Letters to Lydia compiled some of the thousands of letters I'd received from people sharing their own stories of survival and hope. Each book found its audience, and each success brought new opportunities. Publishers competed for my work. Literary agents courted me with offers of representation. Television producers discussed adapting my stories into a documentary series. But the moment that changed everything came on a Tuesday evening in October, exactly 2 years and 4 months after Marcus had handed me $10 and told me to leave his house. I was at home working on my 5th book when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized but hadn't seen in over 2 years. My heart started pounding as I stared at the screen, Marcus's name flashing insistently. For a moment I considered not answering. What could he possibly have to say to me now? What right did he have to intrude on the life I'd built without him? But curiosity won out. City won. On the 4th ring, I picked up the phone. "Hello, Marcus." The voice on the other end was broken, barely recognizable as my son's confident tone. "Mom. Oh God, Mom, is it really you?" I could hear him crying something I hadn't heard since he was a small child. "I saw you," he said through his tears. "On the morning show. I saw you talking about your books, about your success, about how you survived after." His voice broke completely. "After you threw me out." I finished quietly. "Oh God, Mom, what did I do? What did I do to you, to us?" For the first time in over 2 years, I heard my son's voice. Not the cold stranger who'd married Amanda, not the calculating man who'd chosen social status over family love, but Marcus, my little boy who used to help me in the garden and call me every Sunday from college. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I threw away everything that mattered for things that didn't matter at all. Is there any way you could ever forgive me?" I sat in my beautiful office in my comfortable home, surrounded by the evidence of the life I'd built from nothing, and felt something I hadn't expected: sadness. Not for myself, but for him. For the years we'd lost, for the mother he'd rejected when she needed him most, for the man he'd become in his pursuit of a life that had ultimately cost him everything that really mattered. "What happened to Amanda?" I asked. "She left." He said, his voice small and defeated. 6 months ago, as soon as the business started failing and the money problems began. She said I wasn't the man she thought she'd married. She took half of everything and moved to California with someone from her father's country club. Money problems, business failure. The success they'd been so desperate to protect had crumbled anyway. "I lost the house," Marcus continued. "The cars, the investments, everything. I'm living in a studio apartment and working as a bookkeeper for a small firm. But none of that matters compared to what I lost when I lost you." I listened to my son cry on the other end of the line, and I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The cancer I'd survived alone. The community I'd found among strangers who'd become family. The purpose I'd discovered in sharing stories of hope and healing. The success I'd built from nothing but determination and a willingness to start over. All of it had been possible because Marcus had forced me to discover who I could be when I stopped defining myself as his mother and started discovering who I was as Lydia. "I want to see you," he said. "Please, I know I don't deserve it. I know I have no right to ask, but please, let me try to make this right." I looked out my office window at the garden where tomatoes were ripening in the October sun and I made a decision that would define the final chapter of both our stories. "Yes," I said quietly. "You can come see me. But Marcus, you need to understand something. I'm not the same woman you sent away with $10. I'm not the same mother who sacrificed everything and asked for nothing in return. If we're going to have a relationship, it's going to be different. It's going to be honest. And it's going to be based on mutual respect, not guilt or obligation." "Anything," he said quickly. "I'll do anything. I miss my mom. I miss the person who loved me no matter what, and I threw it all away for people who never loved me at all." "Then come," I said. "Come and meet the woman I became after you decided you didn't need her anymore. And we'll see if there's a way forward for both of us." 3 days later, Marcus stood on my front porch, looking older than his 37 years, and carrying flowers from the grocery store. When I opened the door, he took one look at me and broke down completely. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm so sorry. For everything. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try." I stood there for a long moment, looking at this man who'd been my whole world for so many years, then broke my heart so completely I'd thought I might die from it. But I'd survived. More than survived. I'd thrived. "Come in, Marcus," I said finally. "We have a lot to talk about." As he followed me into the beautiful home I'd bought with money I'd earned telling stories about hope and healing, I realized that this was perhaps the most important story of all. Not just about surviving betrayal or building a new life from nothing, but about the possibility of forgiveness, without forgetting love, without sacrifice and family, based on choice rather than obligation. The conversation that followed would be difficult, honest, and sometimes painful. But it would also be the beginning of something new. Not a return to what we'd been, but a cautious step toward what we might become. And maybe I thought as we sat down in my comfortable living room, that was enough. Maybe that was more than enough. Maybe that was everything. The conversation with Marcus lasted 6 hours. We sat in my living room as afternoon turned to evening, working through 2 years of hurt anger, disappointment, and regret. It wasn't an easy discussion, and there were moments when I wondered if too much damage had been done for any real healing to occur. Marcus told me about his marriage's gradual deterioration, how Amanda's demands for an increasingly expensive lifestyle had pushed him to make questionable business decisions. He'd borrowed against his future earnings invested in risky ventures, and ultimately lost everything when the economy shifted, and his clients began demanding refunds for poor advice. "I became someone I didn't recognize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who cared more about appearances than people, more about status than family. I don't know how I got so lost." I listened without interrupting, watching this broken man who'd once been my confident, successful son. Part of me felt vindicated by his downfall, but a larger part felt sad for the years he'd wasted chasing things that ultimately couldn't fulfill him. "When Amanda left," he continued, "I started thinking about what really mattered, and I kept coming back to you. The way you'd sacrificed for me, loved me unconditionally, been there for every important moment of my life, until I needed you to be there for the most important moment of yours, and I failed completely." "Yes," I said simply, "you did fail. You." He flinched at my directness, but I wasn't going to soften the truth now. We'd had enough lies and pretense between us. "I spent months trying to find you," he said. "I went to your old house, but there were new owners. I called the hospital where you worked, but they said you'd resigned shortly after your surgery. It was like you'd disappeared." "I had disappeared," I told him. "The woman who lived in that house, who worked at that hospital, who defined herself entirely as your mother, she couldn't survive what you did to her. So she had to become someone else." I told him about Sunset Gardens, about Helen and Robert, and the community of chosen family I'd found there. I described the first tentative steps toward writing the unexpected success of the books, the speaking engagements that had taken me around the country, sharing stories of hope with people who desperately needed to hear them. "You built all of this," he said, looking around my beautiful home after you threw me away with $10, I finished. "Yes, I built this because I had to, because the alternative was giving up and dying, and I wasn't ready to do that. "I saw your interview on Good Morning America," Marcus said. "You talked about finding purpose later in life, about how sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest opportunities. You looked so confident, so happy, and I realized I was watching a stranger who happened to have my mother's face." "I am a stranger to you now," I agreed. "The woman you knew sacrificed herself for other people. This woman has learned to value herself. The woman you knew asked for nothing. This woman knows what she deserves and isn't afraid to demand it." The hardest part of our conversation came when I told him about the cancer treatment and recovery. How I'd undergone surgery and months of chemotherapy without any family support. How I'd faced the possibility of death surrounded by people I'd known for weeks, rather than the son I'd raised for 35 years. "I could have died," I said bluntly. "And you would never have known, would never have cared." "I would have cared," he protested, tears streaming down his face. "No," I said firmly. "You made a choice about what kind of person you wanted to be. Amanda didn't force you to hand me $10. She didn't force you to turn your back on me when I was facing cancer alone. You chose to do those things because they were easier than standing up for what was right." We talked about forgiveness, and I tried to explain the difference between forgiving someone and trusting them again. I could forgive Marcus for the pain he'd caused me. In fact, I already had. Holding on to anger would have poisoned the beautiful life I'd built. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what had happened or pretending it hadn't revealed something important about his character. "If we're going to have a relationship going forward," I said, "it has to be between two adults who respect each other. I'm not going to be your mother in the way I was before. I'm not going to sacrifice my happiness for yours, and I'm not going to pretend that your choices didn't have consequences." "What kind of relationship can we have then?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Maybe we can be friends. Maybe we can be family again, but a different kind of family based on mutual choice rather than obligation. Or maybe we can't have a relationship at all. That's something we'll have to discover together." Over the following months, Marcus made consistent efforts to prove he was serious about rebuilding our connection. He started seeing a therapist to work through his issues with money, status, and self-worth. He volunteered at a homeless shelter, saying he wanted to understand what it felt like to help people who couldn't give him anything in return. He came to my book signings and speaking engagements, sitting quietly in the audience as I shared stories about resilience and hope. After one particularly moving presentation at a cancer treatment center, he approached me with tears in his eyes. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said. "Not because you're successful or famous, but because you turned something terrible into something beautiful. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and used it to help other people." "That's what survival looks like sometimes," I replied. "Not just living through something, but finding meaning in it." Gradually, carefully, we began building a new relationship. It wasn't the close, dependent bond we'd once shared, but it was honest and real in a way our old relationship had never been. Marcus learned to see me as a complete person rather than just his self-sacrificing mother. I learned to love him as the imperfect human being he was, rather than the ideal son I'd wanted him to be. The media attention around my story intensified when word got out about my estrangement and reconciliation with Marcus. Several magazines wanted to interview both of us about forgiveness and family healing. Television producers approached us about appearing together on talk shows. We declined most of these opportunities. Our rebuilt relationship was too fragile and too precious to exploit for publicity. But we did agree to one interview with a family counselor who specialized in adult parent-child relationships. The conversation was published in a psychology journal and later adapted into a chapter for my 6th book, Rebuilding Bridges: Stories of Family Healing. 2 years after that first phone call, Marcus was doing better. He'd worked his way up to a senior position at a mid-sized accounting firm, had moved into a modest but comfortable apartment, and was slowly rebuilding his financial stability. More importantly, he'd developed friendships based on genuine connection rather than professional networking. He started dating Sarah Martinez, a teacher at the local elementary school, who knew nothing about his previous life of luxury and didn't care about his financial recovery. She was kind, funny, and unpretentious, everything Amanda had never been. When Marcus brought her to meet me, I could see immediately that he was different with her. Relaxed, authentic, happy in a way I'd never seen him during his marriage. "I like her," I told him after Sarah had gone home. "She seems to bring out the best in you." "She does," he agreed. "She doesn't care what I drive or where I live or how much money I make. She just likes spending time with me." I'd forgotten what that felt like. On the third anniversary of our reconciliation, Marcus asked if he could take me to dinner at a nice restaurant downtown. Over dessert, he pulled out a small wrapped box. "It's not much," he said nervously, "but I wanted to give you something that meant something." Inside the box was a simple silver bracelet engraved with the words "Second Chances" and the date of our first conversation after 2 years of silence. "I know I can't undo the past," he said as I examined the bracelet, "but I want you to know that not a day goes by when I'm not grateful you gave me another chance to be your son." I put the bracelet on and felt its weight against my wrist. Not heavy, but substantial. A reminder of how far we'd both traveled to get to this moment. "You know what I've learned," I said, looking across the table at this man who'd caused me such pain and was now bringing me such quiet joy. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or pretending things didn't happen. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of anger and creating space for something new to grow." "And what's growing between us?" Marcus asked. "Respect," I said. "Understanding. A different kind of love based on who we actually are rather than who we thought we should be." As we walked out of the restaurant that night, Marcus offered me his arm for support on the steps. But I didn't need support anymore. I was 70 years old, cancer-free, financially independent, professionally successful, and surrounded by people who valued me for exactly who I was. I'd survived betrayal, abandonment, serious illness, and starting over from nothing. I'd built a life that mattered, found my voice as a writer, and touched thousands of lives through my work. Most importantly, I'd learned that happiness doesn't come from other people's love or approval. It comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to accept less than you deserve from the world. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives are just doorways to the best chapters we never knew we could write. And sometimes the people who hurt us most are simply clearing the way for us to discover who we were always meant to become. If you've listened to this story and found something meaningful in it, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after a betrayal or loss? Have you discovered strengths you didn't know you had? Please share your thoughts, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories of resilience and hope. Remember, it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to discover your worth. And it's never too late to write a better ending to your story than anyone else ever imagined possible. Thank you for listening, and may you always remember that your value isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to treat yourself. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.